questions continue to swirl around the controversy on divestment rules for government officials. And to help us unpack the implications, we are now joined by political analyst and lawyer, Atty. Michael Yusingco. Good morning, Atty. Michael, and welcome to Morning Matters.
Good morning to you, Pauline, and good morning to all the viewers and listeners of the program.
Okay, Attorney, before we get into the intricacies of these divestment rules, I wanted to ask, how satisfied are you with how Congress has been conducting these hearings? In a previous interview, you did call them as performative. What makes you say that?
Well, the reason why I think it's a performative exercise is because I fail to see the in aid of legislation part. No? So there's no question that Congress or lawmakers have the power to conduct inquiries in aid of legislation. So, for example, in just the news bit that preceded our interview, Congressman Redon said that they have information that there was an insertion made during the BICAM. So that fact is good to know, no? Obviously. Mm-hmm. But what follows next? This is my concern. What follows next? Now, if we adhere to what the Constitution says, which is the inquiry must be in aid of legislation, then what follows next from this committee should be recommendation as to how the budget process should be reformed. Mm-hmm. Right? To prevent those kinds of insertions from ever happening again. So that could be overhauling the BICAM mechanism. Maybe it has become too powerful, right? Maybe it has become too insulated from scrutiny. So my problem with the investigations is that they just stay, or they remain stuck at fact-finding. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The next stage, which is really instituting reforms, is what is lacking.
Mm-hmm. But going back to these hearings, Attorney Michael, as I mentioned, there are so many questions swirling around what the divestment rules actually state for public officials. There are at least 5 laws, including the one in the 1987 Constitution, which prohibits public officials from having financial interests in government contracts. But can you clarify to us what the law actually says about the divestment requirement for public officials?
So, Pauline, if we do that, that will probably take one whole day, because as you said, it's very complex. But mm-hmm. let's bring it down to the most basic, the most basic principle, and that is conflict of interest. So what the Constitution and these laws are trying to prevent from happening is the occurrence of a conflict of interest. So, for example, if I am a lawmaker, right? I'm not being a lawmaker doesn't deprive me of owning shares, right? So if I'm a lawmaker, if I have shares, let's say in a blue chip company, that's perfectly fine, right? But conflict of interest arises if I own majority shares in a construction company that deals with government. So that is what the law and the Constitution prohibits. No? It's not owning shares in general, but owning shares or having interest in a business enterprise or a corporation that deals with government. So the rules are complex. That's a fact. But the basic principle is very clear. If a public official has conflict of interest, or a public official has conflict of interest when that public official owns a business or is part of a business or has shares in the business that deals with government directly or indirectly.
Mm-hmm. But how can we categorize specifically, Attorney Michael, this conflict of interest? Is that, kumaga, kailangan nasa papel, there's a paper trail? Because take, for example, Congressman Zaldico, who was a part owner of SunWest, one of the controversial contractors who bagged billions in DPWH projects. But according to Congressman Terry Ridon, he has already divested from that business, so he can't be found in any documents.
Obviously, it has to be based on documents, no? Documentary evidence. But again, let's clarify, no? Interest can be direct or indirect. In other words, let's say in your example, the lawmaker has divested his shares, right? But if his wife or his kid or his brother still has shares, then that can still qualify as conflict of interest because of his indirect interest. So what we're talking about here, of course, is we need documentary evidence to support any assertion of conflict of interest or allegation of conflict of interest. But in defining what conflict of interest would entail, it doesn't mean direct ownership of an enterprise. It can be indirect ownership. So if the best example would always be the spouse. If the spouse of the lawmaker still has shares in a business, then that can still be considered as conflict of interest through indirect link or connection to the business concern.
But apart from having the businesses under the names of their spouses, their relatives, attorney, are there other ways in how these public officials typically skirt this law prohibiting them from having interests in or financial interests in government contracts?
Yes, no. So they will. The best, the most popular way to do it is to use a dummy corporation. No, getting lackeys as stockholders or directors, but really the mastermind behind the firm is still the lawmaker. No? So we also have examples of that. That can still be deemed as conflict of interest, but there is an initial step to be made, which is to pierce the veil of the dummy, right? To prove that the corporation or the business involved is indeed a dummy fronting for the lawmaker. So aside from using relatives, these lawmakers, public officials also use dummies to shield themselves against this conflict of interest prohibition.
But legally speaking, attorney, I mean, does divestment shield government officials from these issues on conflict of interest? Kumbaga, what does the law say actually if nasa pangalan nga ng spouse or meron nga itong tinatawag na dummy person, will they be held accountable, responsible still for that?
Yes. No. So like I said earlier, divestment is not automatically parang an antidote to a conflict of interest prohibition. No, the law is that powerful. No, na conflict of interest can still be a case even if the connection is indirect. The connection of the public official involved is indirect. But that's very clear in the law, and it's also very clear in the Constitution. So the claim of divesting your shares can be proof of wala na akong interest dyan, but the ombudsman and the prosecutors can still provide other evidence to support the indirect link, and therefore can still prove that there was conflict of interest and therefore there is corruption involved in the transaction.
But Attorney Michael, do you think that right now our current disclosure requirements like SAL-ins, are they enough to actually catch hidden business interests of public officials? And is this current framework on divestment and conflict of interest enough? Or what reforms does it need?
First of all, my answer to your question is not enough. Obviously, no, there are still other mechanisms that can be employed, but our problem now, our issue now, is that they are not being enforced enough. So let's start with the enforcement first before we even think of other mechanisms. No, so siguro ngayon ang dapat concern natin is dapat ipatupad ng mas masigasig at least yung SALN, no? Kasi right now, ang batas natin at saligang batas natin, Pauline, they're very clear that the SALNs must be made accessible to the public, no? Subject to only to administrative requirements. But it has to be made accessible to the public. Pero hindi nangyayari, no? Because we had an ombudsman who said na no, this is not the case. Dapat pahirapan natin yung publiko bago ma-access yung SALN, which is wrong, no? So siguro ang concern muna natin ngayon is before thinking of other additional mechanisms, ano muna natin, let's insist first that the SALN be strictly enforced, no? The SALN rule be strictly enforced, and that is making it accessible to the public at all times.
And you're right, Attorney, because there are countries also like the United States and Indonesia who enforce really strict divestment and disqualification rules. So it is possible, right? But what role should the Ombudsman, the Commission on Audit, and even the SEC play in enforcing this and uncovering these conflicts of interest?
But they have very important roles, no? So siguro let's start with the Ombudsman. Kasi ang misconception natin, ang ombudsman is like a court, no? Well, in a way it is, but we have to look at the ombudsman as how it is described by its charter and the constitution as defender of the people, champion of the people. So, yung ombudsman, meron siyang malaking responsibility to be proactive when it comes to preventing corruption. So, pag meron lang siguro whiff of corruption, dapat nagtatrabaho na kagad yung ombudsman. Looking at documents, looking at SEC filings, right? So may role ang ombudsman to be the lead agency in all of these anti-corruption initiatives. Of course, the SEC has to support that role of the ombudsman, no, by providing documentary evidence when the ombudsman requires it. Now, ang COA kasi, they have a very specific function, no, under the Constitution. That's auditing. Now, that has to be also complementary to the role of the ombudsman. No? Because the ombudsman, of course, needs evidence to prove a case, no? Kasi ang ombudsman is a prosecutor of corruption cases. So lahat itong mga agencies na mini-mention natin, they have integral roles to play in the anti-corruption approach of the country. But the lead agency, the lead officer here is the ombudsman.
Is the ombudsman. But Attorney Michael, I don't know if you caught President Marcos's latest podcast. He did say that there will be no sacred cows, friends, not even allies will be spared in this investigation. But I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the real end game here? Will this process ever lead to actual jail time, punishment for politicians, or are we only looking at contractors taking the fall?
Well, that depends on who yung ombudsman is or would be, no? Kasi right now we don't have an ombudsman, where they're still interviewing candidates. Now it's like this, no? This is the reality. If President Marcos appoints an ombudsman who has no connection to him whatsoever, no personal, no professional connection to him, that means, or at least that tells me, that the ombudsman can function really independently. and can pursue cases against political dynasties or dynastic politicians, even lawmakers who are allies of the president or maybe relatives of the president. No? So the key element here is that the ombudsman should have no connection whatsoever to the president, because that is the only way to be assured that the ombudsman can do its job impartially, independently, no, without any influence at all coming from Malacanang.
All right, well, we will be watching and monitoring this closely, but we'll leave that there for now. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us this morning. That was policy analyst and lawyer, Attorney Michael Yusingco. Thanks, Attorney.
Maraming salamat din.